On October 12, 2018, the wind off Lake Michigan carried the smell of rot and wet slate. Ed Vance stood in row 14 of his orchard, looking at a northern spy apple tree that had been planted by his grandfather in the spring of 1952. The tree was gnarled, its bark gray and split like dry bone. Its leaves were small, yellowed at the margins, and curling inward as if trying to shield themselves from the autumn chill. Below them, the fruit was no larger than walnuts, scarred by codling moth larvae and pitted with bitter pit. Ed took a pocket knife from his jeans, knelt in the grass, and tried to push the blade into the earth. The point scraped against the gray clay loam and stopped. It was like trying to stab a sidewalk. For 3 generations, the Vance family had grown apples on these 14 acres in Oceana County. But the soil was tired. Decades of heavy tractor passes, routine applications of synthetic ammonium nitrate, and clean cultivation herbicide strips had left the ground sterile. It was dead dirt, compacted 5 inches down into a concrete-like barrier that the tree roots could not penetrate. The orchard was failing, and everyone in the county knew it. 3 days later, Connor Miller arrived. Connor was 28 years old, wore a clean pair of leather work boots, and carried a laminated soil analysis report from the university. He drove a silver 2017 Chevrolet Silverado with the County Agricultural Extension logo on the door. He was a smart young man, well-meaning, with a degree in agronomy and a folder full of spreadsheets. They stood together under the northern spy tree. Connor took a chrome-plated soil probe from his truck, stepped on the foot peg, and leaned his full weight onto it. The probe went down 3 inches and ground to a halt. Connor stood up, shaking his head. He tapped the laminated paper in his folder. "Your organic matter is at 0.8%, Ed," Connor said. "The soil biology is gone. There are no earthworms, no mycorrhizal fungi, nothing. It's just holding the trees upright, but it isn't feeding them. That's why you've got bitter pit. The trees can't uptake calcium because the roots are suffocating in the hardpan." Ed watched a red-tailed hawk coasting on the thermal above the woodlot. He didn't speak. He took his cap off, wiped his forehead with his sleeve, and put the cap back on. "What do we do?" Ed asked. Connor pulled out a pen. He had a plan. It was written down in 3 clean phases. The first phase was deep ripping the soil between the rows with a 100-horsepower tractor and a 3-shank subsoiler to shatter the compaction. The second was an $18,000 chemical remediation program. It involved liquid calcium injections, 3 applications of synthetic nitrogen, and a heavy systemic herbicide program to keep the understory bare so the trees didn't have to compete with weeds for water. "It's $18,400 for the first year," Connor said. "That's just for the inputs and the custom tractor hire. By year 3, we should see the leaf tissue tests stabilize." Ed looked at the soil probe lying in the grass. He looked at his 1978 John Deere 2040 tractor sitting by the barn. It had 40 horsepower and a slow leak in the hydraulic lift. It could not pull a 3-shank subsoiler. "That's more than the fruit is worth," Ed said. Connor adjusted his glasses. "It's the modern standard, Ed. If you don't break that hardpan and feed these trees, this orchard will be firewood by 2022. You can't fight chemistry." Ed didn't sign the contract. He thanked Connor for his time, walked back to his house, and sat at the kitchen table. He turned on the overhead light. It was a single bulb hanging by a cord. He reached into the drawer of the sideboard and pulled out a small leather-bound ledger from 1934. The cover was worn soft as flannel. Inside, written in the faded, elegant cursive of his grandfather, were the records of the farm before the cooperative started selling synthetic nitrogen in 50-pound bags. On page 42, under the heading Orchard Maintenance, his grandfather had written 3 lines. "Let the grass grow. Sow the clover thick. Let the birds do the weeding, and let them leave their strength behind." On October 22nd, Ed drove his blue 1992 Ford F-150 3 counties over to a small livestock farm near Midland. In the bed of the truck, he had 6 wooden crates. When he returned to Oceana County that evening, the crates were filled with 45 pilgrim geese. They were young birds, gray and white, with heavy chests and orange bills. They hissed when Ed backed the truck up to the barn. The next morning, Ed went to the Shelby Agricultural Co-op. He bypassed the pallets of ammonium nitrate and the white plastic jugs of glyphosate. Instead, he bought 300 pounds of seed, hairy vetch, crimson clover, and daikon radish. Bob, the manager of the co-op, looked at the seed tags. Bob had known Ed since they were boys. "You putting in a pasture, Ed?" Bob asked. "No," Ed said. "Planting the orchard." Bob leaned his elbows on the counter. "The vetch'll grow viney, Ed. It'll crawl up your trunks. And those radishes, they'll smell like rotten cabbage come spring when they melt. They'll drill the clay," Ed said. Bob shook his head and tore the receipt from the register. "It's your funeral, Ed, but Connor over at the extension office says you're turning that place into a swamp." By November 5th, the gossip had found its way to the Hart family diner. The men who farmed 300 acres of clean-tilled cherry orchards down the road sat over their second cups of black coffee, laughing. They called Ed's place the Vance Wildlife Refuge. They talked about how the geese would eat the bark off the trees, how the vetch would choke the low branches, and how the weeds would harbor the mice that would girdle the trunks during the winter. "Ed Vance has gone backward," they said. "A man can't farm with things that honk." Ed did not go to the diner. He worked. He hitched his old grain drill to the John Deere 2040. The hydraulic lift groaned, but it held. He drove the tractor slowly between the rows of gnarled apple trees, dropping the seed mix into the cold, gray clay loam. The discs of the drill barely scratched the surface, leaving thin red lines of crimson clover and dark vetch seeds in the hard dirt. Then he opened the barn door. The 45 pilgrim geese marched out in a single, bobbing line. They did not run. They moved with a slow, deliberate gravity, their heads up, sniffing the cold Michigan air. They entered row 1. To an outsider, it looked like chaos, but Ed stood by the fence and watched. Pilgrim geese do not eat apple bark. They are grass specialists. Their short, heavy bills are designed to clip vegetation close to the ground, like small, self-propelled lawnmowers. As they walked, they began to graze on the tough dandelion leaves and the sparse chickweed that had survived the chemical sprays. Every step they took, they left behind small green drops of manure, rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, and living gut bacteria. And because they weighed only 12 pounds each, their webbed feet did not compact the soil. Instead, they pressed the clover and vetch seeds gently into the earth, sealing them against the winter frosts. By December, the snow came off the lake. It fell heavy and white, burying the orchard under 2 feet of drift. The geese were shut in the barn, living on alfalfa hay and grain. The orchard was silent. Connor Miller drove by once in his silver Silverado. He did not get out. He looked through the window at the rows of bare, gray trees standing in the snow, surrounded by the brown, dead stalks of the radishes that had grown only 3 inches before the freeze. He took a note on his tablet, shifted the truck into drive, and moved on. To the county, the orchard looked abandoned. It looked like a monument to a stubborn old man who had let his land go to seed rather than pay for progress. But beneath the snow, 6 inches down in the dark, the radish roots, thick as carrots, were dying and rotting, leaving open vertical straw pipes in the hard clay. The hairy vetch was dormant, its small roots holding the soil together, waiting for the first touch of the April sun. The land was quiet, but it was not dead. It was waiting. By the second week of April, the snow was gone. What it left behind was not the usual slick gray mud that pooled in the low spots of the county road. In the orchard, the ground was different. The thousands of rotting radish roots had dissolved into the earth, leaving behind a network of vertical, finger-sized tunnels. When the heavy spring rains came, the water did not run off into the ditch, carrying the topsoil with it. It disappeared straight down into the clay, filling those underground channels like water poured into a sponge. On April 18th, Ed drove to a farm near Coldwater and bought 24 Emden geese. They were young birds, white and heavy-bodied, with bright orange bills and blue eyes. He paid $12 a head, loaded them into 4 wooden crates in the back of his blue 1992 Ford F-150, and drove home. He now had a flock of 69 hungry birds. The neighbors watched from their tractors as he let them loose in the first row of northern spies. At the feed store in town, they called them the feathered weed whackers. A man who had farmed 300 acres of corn for 40 years told the clerk that the old man's mind had finally gone soft. Geese, he said, were for fairy tales, not for commercial fruit production. You could not run a modern orchard on 69 pairs of webbed feet. You needed chemistry. You needed horsepower. Ed did not argue. He simply moved his portable polywire fence every 3 days. The geese went to work with a quiet, relentless focus. Their long necks reached into the base of the tree trunks where the weeds grew thickest, the spots where a tractor-pulled mower could never reach without skinning the bark. They targeted the young dandelions, the wild mustard, and the tough rhizomes of quackgrass. More importantly, they ate the fallen, mummified apples from the previous autumn. In those black, shriveled fruits lay the spores of apple scab, a fungus that had plagued the county's orchards for 50 years. In a conventional system, a grower would spray copper fungicide 10 times a season to control it. The geese did the work for free. They ate the diseased fruit, digested the spores, and left behind small green drops of nitrogen-rich manure. By the end of May, the hairy vetch was in full bloom. It looked like a purple carpet rolled out under the apple trees. Ed did not mow it. He let the bees have it. The orchard hummed with a low, heavy vibration that you could hear from the kitchen porch. While the neighbors were out in their cabs wearing rubber suits and respirators, spraying synthetic nitrogen to feed their trees, Ed's orchard was feeding itself. The nodules and the roots of the vetch were extracting nitrogen from the air and depositing it directly into the soil, 6 inches down, right where the apple roots could reach it. June came, and the heat followed. On June 14th, the young agronomist Connor Miller stopped his silver Silverado at the edge of the property again. This time, he got out. He walked with a stiff, modern gait, carrying a chrome soil probe and a clipboard. His leather boots were clean. He did not say hello. He walked over to a northern spy, knelt down, and pushed the steel probe into the ground. He expected the hard, dry resistance of the previous summer. Instead, the probe sank 6 inches into the earth with a quiet, hollow hiss, like a knife sliding into fresh bread. Connor stopped. He pulled the probe out and shook the core of soil into his hand. It was dark brown, almost black, and damp. It did not break into hard, gray puzzle pieces. It crumbled between his fingers like chocolate cake. He smelled it. It did not have the sour, chemical tang of dead clay. It smelled like the floor of an old-growth oak forest. "What's the organic matter?" Connor asked. He did not look up from his hand. "We took a sample last week," Ed said, leaning against the wooden fence post. "It's at 4.2%. It was 0.8 when you wrote that recommendation." Connor was silent. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked at the geese, who were currently sleeping in the shade of a golden delicious, their heads tucked under their wings. "The spreadsheet didn't account for the birds," Connor said. "Spreadsheets don't have webbed feet," Ed replied. Connor looked at the trees. The leaves were not the pale yellow-green of a nitrogen-starved orchard. They were deep, dark forest green, thick as leather, and heavy with the first small, hard green apples of the season. The bark on the trunks looked clean, free of the gray scale that had begun to choke them 2 years ago. "The county had this listed as abandoned," Connor said quietly. "The county looks at things from a truck window," Ed said. Connor stood there for a long time, looking at the soil core in his hand. Then he dropped it, walked back to his Silverado, and drove away. He did not take any notes on his tablet. By mid-September, the harvest began. The apples were not the massive, water-bloated fruit you find in the supermarket bins, the kind grown on synthetic fertilizer that tastes of nothing but sugar and water. They were smaller, dense, and heavy in the hand. When you bit into a northern spy from the center row, it cracked like ice. The juice was sharp and complex, tasting of the deep ground, the vetch, and the cold Michigan nights. A local cider maker from Traverse City drove down in a flatbed truck. He bought every bushel Ed could produce, paying $3 more per bag than the wholesale co-op price. He wanted fruit with high sugar and high acid. He wanted apples that had struggled just enough to find their own character. On the last day of the harvest, Ed's 12-year-old grandson, Cole, was helping him stack the wooden crates near the barn. The sun was low, casting long golden shadows through the rows of stripped trees. The geese were gathered near the barn door, waiting for their evening corn. "Grandpa," the boy said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his flannel shirt, "why didn't we just use the spray like everyone else? It would have been faster." Ed stopped, took off his grease-stained cap, and looked out over the orchard. The soil was covered in a thick mulch of dead vetch and radish leaves, a brown blanket that would protect the earthworms through the coming freeze. "The spray is like a loan from the bank," Ed said. "It makes you look rich today, but it takes your land as collateral. Every year you use it, you have to buy more just to stay in the same place. Pretty soon, you don't own the farm anymore. The company does." He walked over to the blue truck, picked up a bucket of grain, and scattered it for the geese. They rushed forward, a white wave of feathers and loud trumpeting calls. "These birds," Ed said, "they don't send you a bill. They just ask for a little corn and a dry place to sleep, and when they're done, they leave the land better than they found it. That's not progress, Cole. That's just being a good neighbor to the dirt." The boy looked at the geese, then at the dark, rich soil beneath his boots. He didn't say anything, but he nodded. He understood. The modern world is built on the promise of the quick fix. It tells us that if we have a problem, there is a chemical, a machine, or a spreadsheet that can solve it by tomorrow morning. But the land does not operate on a quarterly budget. It does not care about efficiency. It cares about balance. Sometimes the best way forward is to take 3 steps back, to look at what worked before we forgot how to listen to the earth. If you are working a piece of ground, whether it is an acre of garden or 100 acres of fruit, do not be afraid of the slow way. The results do not always show up on a clipboard, but they will show up in the soil. If you want to see how we continue to rebuild this old farm and how we keep the old ways alive in a world that is always trying to sell us the new, hit the subscribe button. Leave a comment about the problems you are facing in your own dirt. We read them all. Until next time, keep your head down, keep your hands dirty, and never let anyone tell you that a flock of geese can't change the world.